So a couple of weeks ago, I released an intro to React hooks video, and I mentioned I wanted to do a video on custom hooks. So that's what we're going to do today. I'm going to take you through some of the custom hooks I use in my own applications. So let's get started. You can see here I have a React component called statistics page, and I am importing a hook called use Boolean. Down here is where I'm actually using the use Boolean hook, and you can see it's set up similar to use state. So use Boolean is invoked and it returns an array, which I've destructured into loading, which is a Boolean, start loading, which is a function, and stop loading, which is also a function. And you can guess what these do. Start loading will turn loading into true, and stop loading will turn loading back to false. So it's very simple and straightforward to use. You can see down here in the fetch sales data function, I'm calling start loading because I want the loading Boolean to be true at this point. Once that's finished, I call stop loading. Further down, you can see where I'm using the loading Boolean. I'm using it inside this render content function to return a loading spinner if loading is true. So if we take a look at the use Boolean hook itself, you can see here it's just a simple React function. Hooks have to be called use hook name. So every hook needs to start with use, and in this case we're just toggling a Boolean, right? So it's called use Boolean. Now it takes an argument, which is default value, and that's set to false by default. But if I wanted use Boolean to be true to begin with, I can pass in true as a default value. So then we're using use state, which we've imported from React. And with use state, we are using a Boolean called is true, and then we're using a function to set the Boolean value. And then we've defined a couple of different functions here. So we have set to true, basically sets the Boolean value to true. Set to false sets the Boolean value to false. And then there's an additional function here called toggle value, which I'm not actually using in that component, but I will show you how I could use it if I wanted to. So toggle value will basically just take the Boolean value and it will set it to the opposite. So if it's true, it will set it to false. If it's false, it will set it back to true. And then I return an array. So you can see here I'm returning the Boolean value, which is true first. Then I have the set to true function next and the set to false function after that. And then the last argument in that array is the toggle value. So if I wanted to use toggle value, I could do it like this. And as you probably know, when destructuring arrays, you can name the variables whatever you want, which is why I don't have this titled set to true and this titled set to false. So I'm naming them stop loading and start loading because that's what I want them to be doing basically. So here I've got toggle loading. Now if I didn't want to use any of these, I can just replace them with commas. So in array destructuring, you don't have to name every element. You can just use a comma to bypass that variable. So toggle loading will always be the fourth value in that array. The next hook I want to show you is more of a specific hook. It just shows you how you can use data and pass that around your application pretty easily. In this case, I'm in the auth wrapper, which wraps all the components inside of my app. And I have a hook here called use current user. So use current user allows me to fetch the value for the current user, but it also allows me to set the value of the current user. So in this case, I have set current user, which I really only want to do once when the authentication state changes. So down here, I'm setting the current user record, and I'm just using that function set current user and passing in the data that I get back from my API. And then anywhere inside of my app that I want to get the current user value, all I need to do is call current user from the use current user hook. So if we look inside the use current user hook, it's very simple. I'm using recoil for state. Now I can do another video on recoil, but think of it like context. It's basically a tool that allows you to share state across your app. So in here, I've got a function called use current user. Again, the hook needs to be named use something. Think of use recoil state as working the same way as use state. So we've got the value and then we've got the setter function. And basically I'm just returning the value and the setter function. And that allows me then to set the value inside of the recoil state. So I don't have to import recoil. I don't have to import the atoms here, which again, I'll explain in another video how that works. You can do the same thing with context. So you would be importing your use context and your actual context value into the hook and then setting it in that context. So again, here's another example of how I use current user. I've imported use current user from hooks here. and then I'm simply destructuring current user off of the return value of use current user. So now I have access to the current user record. Now, use REST API is a hook that I don't actually use in this application because I'm using Firestore and Firebase for my data. I'm not actually making any REST requests. But inside of my app, if I was using traditional GET and POST requests, I would set up a custom hook that looks something like this. So you can see here, I'm importing useState and useEffect from React. I'm importing Axios, but you can use the fetch API if you really want. And then I'm using my own useBoolean hook. So the function here is use REST API, and it takes an object. And inside that object are basically your options. So the options would be your method, it would be the URL, and it would be the body of the request. So if you want to send a post request with an ID and a name or something like that, then you would put that inside of the body, inside of the options object. So I've set a default method as a GET request. So if you wanted to use a post request, you would have to specify that in the object that you've passed in. And so now I've got a useState which sets the data. So I've got the data result and the setter for data. I've got an error handler, so I've got error and set error. And then I'm using the useBoolean hook to set my loading state. And you can see here, I'm actually setting the default to true. Because when you use a hook, it runs on the initial render of the component. So in this case, if I don't have any data, I want loading to be true straight away. I don't want to wait for the hook to be triggered for loading to be true. So I'm starting with loading as true here. And then I've got a perform query function. And the reason I have that as a separate function is it allows me to do a refetch. Now I might want to do a refetch after updating some data. So perform query is an async function. I start by set loading. Now in this case, I've set loading as true as a default. But if I want to do refetch, it's going to be false. So by the time I do refetch, this will have been set to false. So I can again set loading to true. I'm going to clear any errors that might have existed. And then I've got a try catch here, which basically gets the data from Axios by passing in the options. And then once I have fetched the data, I set that in state. If there are any errors, I'm going to catch that error and then set that error in state as well. And once that's finished, I'm going to stop loading. And then I'm using useEffect here. So basically what this does is it runs the perform query function on the initial render. And then down the bottom, I'm returning data, the loading Boolean, any error that might exist, and the refetch function. So theoretically, if I want to use the use REST API hook inside of brochures page, I'm going to do this. I'm going to import it from hooks. And immediately inside the component, I want to get the data, loading, error, and refetch equals use REST API. And I need to pass in an object here with the options. So I'm going to say method, and this time I'm going to say post because get is the default. And then I'm going to say URL equals some URL here. And the body might be an object with an ID of 1. Now you can see there's an error for loading because I've already defined loading, but this is just for demonstration purposes. And finally, on this page, you might have noticed a use API hook being called here. So use API, I'm calling it returns an object, and I'm destructuring all of this stuff from the object that I want to use inside of the component. So use API is actually a hook that I set up in each component that I need to make any API requests from. So I'm trying to separate the data layer from the actual logic and the display layer in the React component. So I pulled out all the data fetching into a use API hook. And you can see here that it's actually being imported locally. I don't have one single use API hook. I have many use API hooks. So inside of this documents folder, I have a use API hook. And this is what it looks like. So it's a function, again, called use API. And I've just given it a unique name to make debugging a bit easier. But inside of here, I'm using all of the hooks that I've got set up. Setting anything in state. I've got all my loading stuff set up here. This is where I'm making any of my network requests. So I've got get brochures. I'm running that inside of a useEffect. Then I've got store brochure data. I've got upload file. So you can see here, anything that is related to a network request goes inside of here. Then at the bottom, I'm returning my Booleans. I'm returning any data that I've got back. And any functions that I need to use within the component. And then finally, I'll just show you, this is my hooks folder. And inside of this folder, you can see all of the hooks that I've set up. And I have an index file, which allows me to do this very simple import from hooks syntax. So I hope that made sense and maybe give you some inspiration for stuff that you can use in your own applications. If you have any questions, leave a comment below. If you liked the video and you found it useful, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you next time.